Hi, everyone. Today we're going to talk about Renaissance France under Louis XIII and Louis XIV as it relates to Tartuffe. But first, I want to jump back just a quick second and sort of sum up the Renaissance and its impact on different cultures. We talked about the Renaissance in Italy, which obviously is where it started. And the two major theatrical impacts we talked about in Italy were these visual and academic extravagances. I showed you these amazing but totally impractical theaters that they built, and this Italianate three-dimensional flat-painted backdrop thing that became a real obsession in Italy and spread to some other places. And then obviously we also talked about commedia and the different stock characters in commedia and the different character types that developed. Then we talked about the Renaissance eventually in England. As we mentioned, it took a little while to get there because England is sort of awkwardly located and had some other cultural issues going on. But when we talked about the Renaissance in England, we talked about the development of Englishness as put forth by Elizabeth, making Englishness a great thing to be, globally speaking. And one of the major ways she did that, obviously, was to develop a culture that is literary and spoken. And we talked about Shakespeare and all the different words and phrases he invented, and how, generally speaking, in Renaissance England, in Elizabethan England, that the English language was the key way in which the culture was expressed. Then we jumped over to Spain. A couple of things. We talked about this notion of the Spanish Golden Age, which was filled with escapist and highly nationalistic entertainment. Not that other nations weren't, obviously, but certainly we see some complexity in England, for instance, that we didn't really see quite as much in Spain. And that escapism and the nationalistic obsession there was a big deal. And we also saw in Spain some heavy Italian influences, especially in set design and especially in court performances. And I showed you some of those sort of just ridiculous, over-the-top, scenic, flat-painted backdrops, but also giant machines used in front of those things to fly people in. And we'll see some of those later in France. So as we move forward and talk about Neoclassical France, let's sort of ask ourselves where we see influences from these other cultures here. England and France are at war quite frequently, so you won't see a lot of similarity there. And Spain and France fight too, but I would say Italy and Spain overall have a pretty big influence on what's going on in France. So let's touch on a little bit of French history here. France is a little bit late to the Renaissance as well. They have a whole lot of sort of long-standing history that makes it hard for them to jump into the Renaissance culture. The 100 Years' War ends in 1453, so that's something that sort of slows them down a little bit. France versus England is a constant military struggle. France is really, really one of the big centers of Catholic versus Protestant strife and shifting allegiances, and so that slows them down a little bit. There are a bunch of other things, but we start getting things headed in the right direction in terms of the Renaissance for France with the ascension to the throne of Louis XIII. And he ascends at the age of 9. So it really isn't Louis who's running the country for quite a long time. He is actually just sort of, obviously as a 9-year-old, this figurehead as a king. But actually it's Prime Minister Cardinal Richelieu who is running the show. And one of the things that Richelieu is trying to do is basically develop French culture in the very similar way that England was trying to develop Englishness under Queen Elizabeth. And you can look at the dates here, right? Queen Elizabeth comes around in the middle of the 1500s. So here we are with Louis XIII and Richelieu coming along in the early 1600s. Shakespeare's already done most of his big work by the time Louis XIII comes to the throne. The point is, France was truly late to the Renaissance. But what he's trying to do, Richelieu, in building French culture, is essentially catch up in a big hurry. And I want to sort of put this perspective on you. All throughout this, we're going to see a lot of different ways in which France tried to be very showy and say, hey, all right, fine, whatever, we're late to the Renaissance. I don't really want to talk about that. What I do want to talk about, says France, is how awesome I am, how great Frenchness is, and how extravagant, and they do this with visual culture in a big way, how extravagant and indulgent and opulent France can be to prove how awesome we are, right? It's a little bit like the newly rich guy, right, who didn't grow up rich, but is newly rich because his business made $1 million or whatever. And so he goes out and buys 1 million ridiculous cars and clothes and just really tries to show off and be opulent in this exterior kind of way. A lot of that is what France was doing in this era. So eventually Louis XIII grows up and becomes this stereotype of a French guy. I mean, it really works the other way around, but check out the mustache and the ridiculous long hair, and he's showing off his calves there. Showing off your calves in this area was a very sexy thing for men to do. And we'll see Louis XIV does it as well. But in developing culture, one of the things Richelieu does is notices like, hey, all right, theater is one way in which we could actually develop some culture. And so they allow the first permanent theater company in France, specifically in Paris in 1629. And before that, they allowed traveling players, but that was it. So this is the Royal Company at the Hôtel de Bourgogne, pictured there on the left. And this is just a little scene. We don't need to go into the details of it. But the fact is that theater is one of the ways in which France identified it would be a good idea to develop and build its own culture. The other thing the French do under Richelieu is, and Louis XIII, is in 1636-37, they create the French Academy. This is an academy that has a membership of 40 people and only 40 people. And these 40 people are the great people of French culture. So we have artists, we have scientists and poets and painters and philosophers and scholars and all kinds of people, right? They're appointed initially by the government, but then you have to then after that be inducted into the French Academy. And what we're doing here is institutionalizing in a very rigid manner what French culture is. And the Academy, and we'll talk about this later, they didn't just sit around and talk to each other and be smart, pat each other on the back. They did a lot of that, but they also got to make rulings on French art and French culture. So we'll talk about it later, but the Academy is sort of this ruling body of what French culture is, and they can say, yes, that is a good idea, or this play, we do not like that play, and we're going to censor it and ban it, etc. So if you want to put on a work of art or a work of culture of any kind in France in this era, you have to get by the Academy. The Academy is still around today, and it still has only 40 members. So you have to wait. If you want to get into the French Academy, you have to wait for somebody to die. And then there's this whole other really complex process. But anyway, so in 1642, Richelieu dies, and 1643, out of deference, Louis dies as well, which brings us to our biggest gentleman in the history of Neoclassical France, Louis XIV. And Louis XIV's rules, look at that, 1643 to 1715, for a really long time. He ascends the throne, as pictured here, very young, but he is a powerful and long-standing monarch that really defines what it is to be French. And we'll talk about the ways in which he does that later. Initially, though, like I said, he's young. And so the country, there he is. Eventually, he grows up to become this fantastic guy with, again, right, sexy French calves and all this other business. It's a very opulent display of self. And we'll talk about some other examples of that later. So we have Prime Minister Cardinal Mazarin. Just as Richelieu ran the show when Louis XIII was young, Mazarin runs the show when Louis XIV is young. Interestingly enough, Cardinal Mazarin's real name is Cardinal Mazarini. He is Italian, and one of the things he does very deliberately was tries to bring Italian culture to France. Because, I mean, if you look around Europe at this time, the Italians, they, after all, invented the Renaissance, so they're kind of a good culture to imitate. One of the challenges that Louis XIV and especially Mazarin have to put up with is La Fronde Rebellion. This is a long-standing rebellion of nobles. Pictured here is the Battle of the Dunes in 1653. And so we've got a long-standing battle between the king and the French nobility. And the king wants power. Mazarin wants the king to have power. The nobility would rather have the power, and there are numerous military clashes. The whole thing ends in 1653 when Louis XIV finally prevails, and it was a touch-and-go kind of a thing. There were points where Louis XIV had to leave Paris in a hurry because he thought he was going to be assassinated and taken over. And one of the things he does, Louis XIV, is rather than putting all the French nobility in actual prison or killing them, he instead builds this magnificent palace out in the country and forces them to stay there. I'll explain that a little bit more in a minute, but it's this very important idea that French nobility are, we talked about this a little bit with Spain, French nobility are nobles first and criminals second. So yes, we'll treat them like criminals, but they're also nobles, so we can't just, cut their heads off. So what we get through Louis XIV's reign and during the time of Tartuffe is Louis XIV becomes the definition of an absolute monarch. There's a famous quote from him that is essentially, the quote is, "I am France." And because he's also associated with the church and because he's in charge, he's basically God, right? The Pope is technically more important because we're Catholics here in France at the time. The Pope is technically more important, but really he's a big deal. This is a picture of Louis XIV performing in a ballet, which is kind of awesome, as the character of the sun. And we refer to him as the Sun King. So here he is as Apollo in the Ballet of the Night, and it's a really interesting sort of metaphor there. But a big, big, powerful gentleman. Also, all throughout France, all throughout Louis XIV's era, is this relentless and opulent display of wealth, of culture, and most importantly, right, of stability. And there you see the building of Versailles. This is an early painting of Versailles, which is this, if you don't know about it, right, this magnificent, opulent palace just a little ways outside of France, that is one of the single greatest expressions of French Renaissance culture. And we'll talk about some details later. But it wasn't just a palace, like I said before. It was basically a prison. All the rebellious nobility of France were imprisoned out there and not really allowed to leave. Louis could keep a good eye on them, and they could sort of keep track of everything that was going on. And he could also constantly, through the awesomeness of Versailles, remind everybody, hey, I'm in charge. This is how great I am. Also, we are in an era where Catholicism is a really big deal. But unlike, say, in Spain, where they were genuinely obsessed with Catholicism, sort of, kind of, it's really superficial in this era. So being holy is an external kind of a thing. And obviously you see this in Tartuffe. But it's more about Catholicism as a means towards showing how great France is. And there's the Cathedral Notre Dame, and that was built long before this era, but still one of the many examples that you might see if you walked around France. Wow, this country's really incredible, and Catholicism is amazing, and Catholicism, it means that France is amazing. So my first discussion question for you is, two of them here, how does the play, Tartuffe, fit into the specific world we've just described? Fundamentally nationalistically French, Catholic, but superficially so, and ruled by an absolute monarch, somebody who's constantly and unquestionably in charge. And then, since we're talking about other Renaissance storytelling modes, talk to me about England, Italy, and Spain and how we see similar or different genres, plot structures, character types, styles, contents, anything compared to other Renaissance cultures.